She had $32 a single bag and a letter that said she was not wanted. The last train out of Cedar Ridge left at 4. She had until morning to decide what came next. What she could not have known was that somewhere on that same platform, a 5-year-old girl was already walking toward her, carrying a worn bear with one good ear and a question that had no right to be that precise. Did Mama send you? This is the story of what happened when Eleanor Harper stayed. The last train of the day had already gone. Its smoke still hung in the cold October air above Cedar Ridge Station, drifting west toward the mountains like something that had given up trying to stay. The platform was nearly empty now. A station hand was pushing a flat cart toward the freight door. 2 men in work coats were loading sacks of grain onto a wagon at the far end. A dog lay curled beneath a bench near the water barrel, paying no attention to anything. And on the wooden bench closest to the eastern rail, a young woman sat alone. She sat the way a person sits when they are trying very hard not to fall apart in public. Back straight, chin level, hands folded in her lap around a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had gone soft. She was 24 years old, though she looked older than that in this moment the way grief can add years to a face in an afternoon. Her traveling dress was navy blue, good quality once, now carrying 5 days of train soot and worry in its fabric. A single leather satchel sat at her feet, worn at the handles, the kind of bag that tells you everything about a person's circumstances without saying a word. Her name was Eleanor Harper. She had come from Philadelphia. She had come a very long way, and the piece of paper in her hands was the reason she was still sitting here instead of being somewhere else. She read it again, not because she had forgotten the words, but because some part of her still could not fully accept that they were real. Miss Harper is not what this arrangement requires. Her background falls considerably below the standards expected of a woman entering the Whitfield household. The arrangement is hereby terminated. Return passage to Philadelphia departs tomorrow morning. Transportation has been arranged and prepaid. No apology, no signature beyond the wax seal of one Aldous Whitfield, who was the richest man in Cedar Ridge County and apparently did not feel that personal decency was required of a man in his position. Eleanor had not met him. She had traveled 5 days by rail to meet him, had stepped off the train into the thin Colorado air, with her heart doing something she could only describe as hopeful, and had been handed this letter by a man in a dark coat who did not make eye contact and walked away before she could ask a single question. That had been 3 hours ago. Eleanor was not a woman who cried easily. She had grown up in a house where difficulty was simply a condition of living, not a reason to stop. Her father, a bookbinder by trade, had been the kind of man who believed that a clear mind and steady hands could resolve most of what life threw at a person. Her mother had believed the same, and had added to it the conviction that one should always look for what was useful in a situation before mourning what was lost. Both of them were gone now. Fever had taken her father when she was 19. Her mother followed 2 years later, leaving Eleanor with a small room she rented on Calloway Street, a job as a secretary in a law firm that paid enough to survive and not quite enough to do anything else, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people while being entirely alone in the world. She had not answered Whitfield's advertisement because she was desperate. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind even now, even sitting on this bench with $32 to her name and nowhere to go. She had answered it because it had seemed for the first time in a long time like a door that led somewhere real. The advertisement had been straightforward. A rancher of means in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, seeking an educated and capable woman of good character to serve as wife and partner. The correspondence that followed over 3 months had seemed genuine enough. Whitfield wrote about the ranch, about the mountains, about the practical demands of a frontier life that he believed required a woman of intelligence and industry. Eleanor had written honestly about herself. She had not exaggerated anything. She had simply described who she was. Apparently who she was had not been enough. She pressed the letter flat against her knee and looked out at the mountains. They were extraordinary, she had to admit that. Even now, even sitting in the wreckage of a plan she had built carefully over months, the Rockies in late October took the breath from her chest. The peaks caught the last of the afternoon light at angles that made them look like something from a painting, burnt orange and deep purple, and a white so bright it hurt to look at directly. Cedar Ridge town lay at the base of those mountains, a proper frontier settlement with a mill and a general store and a church and a courthouse, all of it spread along the valley floor like a hand open flat. She had glimpsed it through the train window an hour before arriving and thought it looked like a place where a person could build something real. She still thought that. That was almost the hardest part. The dog under the bench on the far side of the platform lifted its head, sniffed the air once, and laid it back down. The station hand disappeared through the freight door. The light was dropping fast now, the way it does in mountain country in autumn, going from afternoon to evening in what feels like minutes. Eleanor was trying to calculate whether $32 was enough for one night in the hotel she had noticed on the main street and a proper meal, and still leave her enough for the return journey when she became aware that someone was standing in front of her. She looked up. The girl was perhaps 5 years old, possibly younger, possibly older. It was difficult to say with children that age. She had blonde hair in two braids that had been neat this morning and were now somewhat less so, tied at the ends with ribbons that had once been blue and were now a pale washed-out version of that color. She wore a dress that had been made by hand. You could see the stitching was not professional, but it was clean and pressed, and someone had cared about the hemline. In the crook of her left arm she carried a stuffed bear brown, considerably loved, with one ear slightly more worn than the other, from what was obviously a preferred side for sleeping. She was looking at Eleanor with the kind of direct, uncomplicated attention that children give to things they find genuinely interesting. There was no shyness in it, no performance, just a clear-eyed, honest examination. "Are you sad, miss?" the girl asked. The question was so simple and so accurate that Eleanor felt something shift behind her sternum. She had been holding herself together all afternoon through a combination of pride and stubbornness, and the conviction that crying in a train station was not something she was going to do. The child's question, utterly without judgment, utterly without agenda, came very close to undoing all of that. A little, Eleanor said, "Yes." The girl nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she climbed up onto the bench beside Eleanor without asking permission, settling herself with the comfort of someone who had decided this was where she needed to be and was not concerned about the protocol involved. She arranged the bear in her lap and looked out at the tracks. "My name is Clara Morrison," she said. "This is Mr. Buttons." She lifted the bear briefly in introduction and then set him back down. "My name is Eleanor Harper," Eleanor said. "It is very nice to meet you both." Clara considered this for a moment. "Mama always said we should check on sad people," she said. "She said it costs nothing, and sometimes it is the exact thing a person needs." She paused and then added in a slightly different register, quieter and more careful, "Mama is not here anymore, so I check." The way she said it was not a bid for sympathy. It was a statement of fact delivered with the dignity of someone who had already done a great deal of work to make peace with that fact, even if the work was only half finished and would probably never be fully done. Eleanor recognized it immediately, the particular manner of a child who has learned to carry loss without making it a burden to others because the adults around them were already carrying enough. "Your mama sounds like she was a very wise woman," Eleanor said quietly. "She was the wisest," Clara agreed with complete conviction. Then she tilted her head and looked at Eleanor sideways. "Did someone break a promise to you?" Eleanor blinked. "What makes you ask that?" "Because you look like how Papa looks sometimes when he thinks about things that were supposed to be different." Clara hugged Mr. Buttons slightly closer. "He says that is what disappointment looks like. Not just sad, sad and surprised at the same time." "Your Papa sounds like he knows what he's talking about." "He knows most things," Clara said with the fierce certainty of a child who has never had reason to doubt the central pillar of her world. "He is not very good at braiding hair, and he cannot remember the songs Mama sang when it thundered." She paused again, and then the directness returned. "Can you sing, Miss Eleanor?" They talked a while longer, Clara narrating the details of her life at the ranch with the thoroughness of someone who has decided a new person deserves to be properly informed. She talked about her father and her uncles, and about Mr. Buttons and his various opinions, and about the apple tree behind the smokehouse that still had good apples on it if you knew which branches to look at. Eleanor listened and answered, and found herself doing something she had not expected to do on this particular afternoon, which was to stop thinking about the letter in her lap and simply be present with this child who had arrived without announcement and taken up residence beside her as if she had always meant to be there. It was toward the end of this conversation, in one of the natural pauses that children allow when they are thinking about what comes next, that Clara grew briefly still. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was different from her usual directness, something more searching in it, as if she were checking something she already half believed. "Miss Eleanor," she said, "did Mama send you?" The question arrived the way children ask the things that matter most, without preamble, without setup, as if the answer were simply something that needed to be confirmed rather than discovered. Eleanor looked at this 5-year-old who was watching her with complete seriousness, waiting with the patience of someone who has asked an important question and intends to hear the answer. "I don't know, sweetheart," Eleanor said honestly. "I don't know about things like that." Clara considered this for a moment, turning it over with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Then she nodded in the way of someone who has decided that "I don't know" is not the same as "no," and that this distinction matters. Before Eleanor could find anything to say to that, the sound of boots on the platform planking reached them from the direction of the station master's office. Not one set of footsteps. Three. And moving at the particular pace of men who have just realized something requires their attention. What Eleanor saw when she looked up would stay with her for the rest of her life, though she would not have been able to explain precisely why. Perhaps it was the quality of the light at that exact moment, the late afternoon sun dropping behind the mountains and throwing everything into that burnished, golden-edged clarity that comes in the last hour before Colorado darkness. Perhaps it was the contrast: three large men moving with purpose across a nearly empty platform, their forms solid and certain in a landscape that had started to feel uncertain to her. Or perhaps it was simply that she had spent the last 3 hours sitting with evidence of what a man could be at his worst, and these three arrived looking like something altogether different. The man in front was the tallest. He stood well over 6 feet and was built the way men are built who have spent years doing actual physical work in hard country, not wide with bulk, but dense with it, the kind of strength that comes from necessity rather than vanity. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who work outdoors in mountain climates. The skin pulled tight across strong bones, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of squinting against altitude, sun, and wind. His eyes were an unusual color, amber, almost the color of good whiskey held up to light, and they found Clara first, and then moved to Eleanor with the swift, assessing quality of a man who had learned to read situations quickly. He was somewhere in his early 30s. He wore work clothes that had seen real use: denim and canvas, and a wide-brimmed hat pushed back from his forehead. And he carried himself with the unhurried confidence of someone who did not need to perform authority because he simply had it. The man immediately behind him was perhaps 5 years younger, with hair that tended toward auburn and eyes the color of autumn grass, warm and observant. Where the first man's face was closed and controlled, this one's was more open, carrying the quality of someone who approached the world with genuine curiosity and responded to it with genuine warmth. He noticed Eleanor looking and gave a brief natural nod, the kind of acknowledgement that costs nothing and communicates basic human decency. He did it without thinking, which meant it was simply who he was. The third man was the youngest, perhaps mid-20s, with dark blonde hair and eyes that were a pale, sharp gray. He moved with the slightly quicker energy of the youngest, in a family someone who had spent years trying to keep up and had developed a particular alertness as a result. He looked at Eleanor with unconcealed interest, not rude, just direct, in the manner of someone who had not yet learned the adult habit of pretending not to notice things. Clara turned on the bench when she heard the footsteps. "Papa," she said, not with the guiltiness of a child caught somewhere she should not be, but with the satisfaction of someone whose timing had worked out perfectly. She was sad. "Mama always said we should check." The man in front, Cade Morrison, as Eleanor would shortly learn, stopped in front of the bench. He removed his hat in a gesture so automatic it was clearly something he had been taught very young and had never stopped doing. He looked at his daughter, and something moved briefly behind those amber eyes, something gentle and complicated that was there, and then carefully set aside. "I hope she has not been bothering you, miss," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to carry weight. "She has not been bothering me at all," Eleanor said. She stood because she had been taught that standing was the respectful thing to do when being addressed, and because she was not going to let this afternoon finish with her, collapsed on a bench looking like someone who needed rescuing. "Your daughter is very perceptive. My name is Eleanor Harper." Cade Morrison looked at her steadily. "Cade Morrison. These are my brothers Reed and Flint." A slight movement of his head indicated the men behind him. "Are you passing through, Miss Harper, or were you expected here?" The question was asked without any particular inflection, and yet somehow it contained within it enough space for Eleanor to answer honestly or not as she chose. It did not press. It simply asked. "I came here to marry Aldous Whitfield," Eleanor said. She kept her voice level. "When I arrived, he decided I was not what he required. He has arranged return passage to Philadelphia for tomorrow morning. I have funds for the ticket, but very little beyond that." She said it plainly because there was no useful version of this situation that involved pretending it was something other than what it was. She had come a very long way on the word of a man who had not been worth the trust. That was the situation. It was humiliating, and it was real, and she was not going to dress it up. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was Flint who broke it, the youngest brother, and he did it with exactly 2 words spoken in a flat voice that somehow managed to contain multitudes. "Aldous Whitfield," he said, then nothing else. But the way he said it communicated very clearly that what Whitfield had done was entirely consistent with what Whitfield could be expected to do, and that this did not surprise him in the slightest. Reed, the middle brother, said nothing at all. He simply looked at Eleanor with an expression that she could only describe as honest recognition, the look of someone who understood exactly what kind of afternoon she had been having. Cade Morrison looked at his daughter, who was watching him with the calm certainty of a child who has already decided what the right answer is and is waiting for the adults to catch up. Then he looked back at Eleanor. Something was working in him behind the steady amber eyes, some private calculation being made and resolved. "Miss Harper," he said, "we could use help at the ranch. Bookkeeping, correspondence, management of the household records. Things I have not managed well since—" He stopped there, a brief and deliberate stop, the kind that indicates a door being kept closed rather than forgotten. "It would be honest work for honest pay and proper accommodation, until you determine what you want to do next." Eleanor looked at this man who had been a stranger to her approximately 4 minutes ago. She looked at Clara, who was sitting on the bench watching this exchange with the expression of someone watching a play whose ending she already knows. She looked at the letter still in her hand, the wax seal of a man who had weighed her and found her insufficient. "I would be grateful for that," she said. "Thank you." Clara slid off the bench and came to stand beside Eleanor, and then without any announcement or ceremony, tucked her small hand into Eleanor's. It was done with the calm matter-of-factness of a child who has decided something and sees no reason to make a fuss about it. Eleanor looked down at the small hand in hers, and something in her chest did something she could not quite name. They walked toward the wagon together, the 5 of them, through the last of the October light. The road out of Cedar Ridge wound north and then west, climbing gradually into the foothills as the town dropped away behind them. The mountains ahead were enormous in the early evening light, their upper slopes already in shadow, the lower ridges still catching gold. The air was cold and sharp and smelled of pine and something else. Something Eleanor could not immediately identify. A mineral quality, clean and ancient, that she would later understand was simply the smell of genuine wilderness. Philadelphia had not prepared her for any of this. Nothing had. Cade drove the wagon in silence, his hands steady on the reins, his attention on the road ahead. Clara sat between Eleanor and Reed on the bench behind the front seat, Mr. Buttons on her lap, asking Eleanor questions about Philadelphia, with the tireless curiosity of a child for whom the city might as well have been the moon. Reed answered what Clara directed at him and offered occasional quiet comments of his own. Flint rode separately on horseback, ranging slightly ahead of the wagon, and then circling back the way a man does when he is accustomed to using his body and finds stillness difficult. Eleanor answered Clara's questions and looked at the country around her and tried to understand what was happening. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be carried by events without attempting to understand the current. Something about this family had resolved itself quickly in her mind during the short time at the station, some qualities she had observed that she was trying now to put into words. It was not anything as simple as kindness, though there had been kindness in Cade Morrison's offer. It was more like the qualities she associated with people who were fundamentally oriented toward what was true rather than what was convenient. She had spent 3 years working in a law firm and had learned to distinguish quickly between the two. Morrison Ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, and Eleanor saw it in the fading light as something that had been built with intention. The main house was constructed of timber large and solidly proportioned with a covered porch, wrapping its front face in a stone chimney at each end. The outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, several smaller structures, she could not immediately identify were arranged around it with the practical logic of a place that had been worked hard and thought about carefully. Beyond the buildings, the land rolled away toward the mountains in waves of autumn grass, pale gold in the last light with dark stands of pine on the higher ridges. She learned the story of the place over the following days in fragments from Reed and from Clara, and later from what she observed herself. James Morrison had come to Colorado in 1853 with a wagon, a wife, and 3 boys still young enough that the mountains seemed like an adventure rather than a hardship, carrying the kind of conviction that moves people across a continent. In the 19th century, the belief that a man who was willing to work hard enough could build something in this country that would outlast him. He had been right about the work required, and he had been right about what it could produce. 2,000 acres a cattle operation that was modest by the standards of some spreads in the county, but solid and well managed, and a name in Cedar Ridge that meant what it said. James Morrison had died 4 years ago. What he left his sons was not money. It was the land and the expectation that they would keep it. Cade had married Margaret Cooper 8 years ago, the daughter of a neighboring family. A woman who, by all accounts, had been the kind of person who makes a house feel like something more than a building. Clara had come 3 years after the wedding, and then 2 years after Clara Margaret had died of a fever that moved through the valley one winter and took several people with it. All of them too fast, all of them too soon. Cade had been 31 years old. He had been managing the ranch and raising his daughter and carrying whatever he carried in silence since then with his brothers at his side. Reed and Flint had stayed. Not because they had no choices. Eleanor learned later that Reed had been offered work in Denver and Flint had received correspondence from a ranch in Wyoming, but because they had looked at their brother and at their niece and understood what staying meant and chosen it anyway. That was the kind of thing that does not require discussion among men who know each other well enough. Clara was raised by 3 men who loved her in 3 different registers. Cade loved her with the particular intensity of someone who has already lost the most important thing in his life and will not allow himself to lose another, which expressed itself as protection and presence, and a consistency so thorough it had become the architecture of the child's world. Reed loved her with warmth and patience, the kind of uncle who sits and listens to long, winding stories about nothing in particular and finds them genuinely interesting. Flint loved her with the energy of someone who had essentially refused to entirely grow up, who would race her across the yard and let her win, and then dispute the result in a way that made her argue back, which she enjoyed enormously. It was a good life. Eleanor could see that clearly even in her first hours there. It was a hard life in the practical sense of that word, demanding and physical, and without much in the way of ease or comfort beyond what the people in it brought to each other. But it was good. What it was missing, she also saw clearly, though she would not have put it into words, not then, not yet. That first night after a supper of venison stew that Flint had apparently produced through a combination of stubbornness and improvisation, after Clara had been persuaded to sit still long enough to have her hair brushed out and rebraided for bed, Eleanor was shown to a room at the northeast corner of the house. It was small and simply furnished a bed with a heavy quilt, a washstand, a chair, a window that looked out toward the mountains. Someone had placed a small clay pot with dried wildflowers on the windowsill. The flowers were long past their season, but the gesture was there, dry and colorless, and somehow still a gesture. She was unpacking her satchel when she heard footsteps in the hall, small and deliberate, and then a knock on the door that was clearly Clara's knock, because it was approximately the height of a 5-year-old's reach. She opened the door. Clara stood there in her nightgown, Mr. Buttons held tight against her chest, her freshly braided hair already showing signs of the process by which children undo, in 10 minutes, what took 20 minutes to accomplish. Do you know the songs, Clara said without preamble, that make the thunder not scary? Eleanor looked at this child in the doorway, and something settled in her chest, warm and quiet, in a place that had been cold for a very long time. I know a few, she said. Would you like to hear one tonight? Clara came in without waiting for further invitation, climbed onto the foot of the bed, arranged Mr. Buttons against the pillow, and looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone prepared to evaluate what came next with fair and open-minded attention. Eleanor sat on the edge of the chair and sang the song her own mother had sung to her, a Pennsylvania folk melody about the rivers coming down from the hills to meet the sea. Not a complicated song, not a particularly beautiful one in any technical sense, but real the way a song is real, when it has been passed from one person to another by love rather than by instruction. Her voice was not trained, but it was honest. Clara was asleep before the second verse was finished. Eleanor pulled the quilt up over the child's shoulders and stood for a moment in the quiet of the room, listening to the mountain wind move along the outside of the house. And then she heard it. Footsteps in the hall, heavy, deliberate, the unhurried stride of a grown man. She heard them stop outside her door where the strip of lamplight would have been visible through the gap at the bottom. The footsteps did not continue for a long moment. They simply stopped and held there in the dark hall, and then without any sound that she could hear, moved away. In the morning when she came into the kitchen, she found a stack of firewood neatly placed beside the stove in her room. The wood had been split, and the pieces were exactly the right size for the small fireplace in the wall. No one mentioned it. No one acknowledged it in any way. It was simply there. She understood in the way that adults understand the unspoken language of people who express care through action rather than declaration. And she filed it away in the quiet inventory she was already keeping of this place and the people in it. The work began in earnest on the third day. Cade showed her to the ranch's small office, a room off the main hallway containing a desk, several shelves of ledgers and folders, and a state of organizational disorder that would have made Eleanor's former employer at the law firm physically ill. There were receipts mixed with correspondence, mixed with land records, mixed with what appeared to be a 3-year accumulation of papers that had been placed in this room because placing them somewhere else required a decision that had never quite been made. It was not the disorder of a careless man. It was the disorder of a man who had too many things to manage and had decided reasonably which ones took priority. I know it is not in good order, Cade said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man confessing something he is not particularly happy to confess. It is in recoverable order, Eleanor said, which was true and also the most useful thing to say. Give me a few days. He looked at her for a moment with those steady, amber eyes, and then he nodded once and left her to it. No instructions, no hovering, no check-ins. He had offered her the work and then trusted her to do it, which she found she respected more than she could have anticipated. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon sorting and cataloging and beginning to build a kind of filing system that would allow someone to find a document in less than an hour. Clara came and sat in the corner for a while, drawing pictures in the margins of a used piece of paper, occasionally offering opinions about the color of the afternoon light through the window. Reed appeared in the doorway around midday with coffee, left it on the corner of the desk, and went away again without making her stop working. Flint came by once, looked over her shoulder at what she was doing, made a sound that was not quite skeptical and not quite approving, and then wandered off. It was on the second afternoon of this work, deep in a folder that had clearly not been opened in some time, that she found the map. It was a surveyor's map of the Cedar Ridge Valley, detailed and carefully drawn with property boundaries marked in black ink. Morrison Ranch occupied a significant portion of the northern section of the valley, and someone at some point had added a notation in red ink tracing a line across the property that she initially took to be a road or a fence line. She looked at it more carefully. The red line followed a winding path across the northern section of the Morrison property, up toward where the foothills began, and she saw that it connected in a continuous flow to what appeared to be the watershed notation in the valley below. She understood what she was looking at. 3 years in a law firm that handled property cases had given her a working knowledge of water rights in agricultural regions, and Colorado in the 1870s was in the middle of the kind of disputes over water access that would define the territory for generations. Whoever controlled high-altitude sources controlled what flowed downstream. The northern pasture of Morrison Ranch sat directly over the primary water source for the lower valley. A dozen smaller farms. The eastern residential district of Cedar Ridge itself. She set the map aside and continued sorting. In the next folder, she found the letters. There were 4 of them spread across a period of roughly 12 months, all written on heavy stationery with a letterhead that read, Aldous Whitfield, Cedar Ridge County. Each letter was an offer to purchase the northern section of Morrison Ranch, and each offer was higher than the last. The numbers increased with the particular escalation of someone who is determined but has a limit he cannot yet reveal. Each letter had a brief reply written in pencil in the margin, in what she recognized as Cade's handwriting, controlled and clear. Not for sale. In one form of those words or another 4 times. Eleanor sat with these documents for a moment and let what she was seeing arrange itself in her mind. Aldous Whitfield had been trying for over a year to acquire a specific piece of land that contained the water rights for the entire lower valley. The Morrison family had refused every offer. And then in this same period, Aldous Whitfield had placed an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper seeking a wife, a woman of education and good character, he had written, a capable woman for a frontier life. And Eleanor had answered it in exchange letters for 3 months and traveled 5 days by rail and been rejected at the station with a letter so cold it might have been written by a machine. Why would a man in his position place that advertisement at all and then discard the result so summarily? She did not have the full answer yet, but she was sitting in the middle of enough pieces to understand that there was a picture forming and that the picture included her and that she needed to understand it clearly before she could know what to do. She placed everything back in its proper order and continued her work. It was toward the end of that same week on an afternoon when the October light was doing its particular mountain thing of making everything look both sharper and more golden than it actually was, that she was sitting in the main room with Clara, who had been attempting to explain the precise social dynamics of the arrangement between Mr. Buttons and a small wooden horse that lived on the bookshelf when the child stopped mid-sentence and looked at Eleanor with sudden seriousness. Miss Eleanor, she said, when Papa asked Mama to marry him, Mama told me something about it once. She considered this memory with the care a child gives to things they are trying to get exactly right. She said she knew it was right because she was not scared. She said when you are scared of something, it usually means you do not trust it yet. And when you stop being scared, it means you do. Eleanor set down the piece of mending she had been working through and gave Clara her full attention because that was what the moment asked for. Your mama was very wise, she said. Are you scared? Clara asked. The question was direct and genuine, unencumbered by any of the social cushioning that adults learn to wrap around their harder inquiries. Eleanor thought about it honestly. A little, she said. Yes. Of what part? Of wanting something, Eleanor said, and being wrong about it again. Claire absorbed this with the serious nod of someone filing it carefully. Papa is scared of the same thing, she said, looking down at Mr. Buttons. I can tell because he works extra hard on the days when he is thinking about it. He goes out before it is even light and comes in after it is dark, and he does not talk much at supper. She paused. He has been doing that more since you came. Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was sometimes the most honest response available. Then Clara looked up with a different expression, suddenly and completely 5 years old again. Can we go see if there are any late apples on the tree behind the smokehouse? Flint said there might be some. And the conversation was over, folded away as simply as a piece of paper, the way children do with things that are too large to hold, and so are simply set down for a while. Aldous Whitfield came to Morrison Ranch on the 12th day. He came on a large black horse, well-fed and well-groomed, the horse of a man who understands that the quality of what you ride communicates something about what you are. He brought 2 men with him, hired hands of the type that serve as visual punctuation in conversations where someone wants to make a point about how serious they are. He wore a suit coat that belonged in a city office rather than a mountain ranch, and he wore it with the complete comfort of someone who has decided long ago that the world will adjust itself to his standards rather than the other way around. Eleanor was on the porch when he rode in, working through a stack of correspondence she had organized for Cade's attention. She saw Whitfield see her, and she watched his face in that first fraction of a second before his expression was composed. What she saw there was not surprise exactly. It was the swift, involuntary recalculation of a man who has found a variable in an equation he thought he had already solved. He recovered immediately, of course. Men like Aldous Whitfield were very good at recovering. "Miss Harper," he said with the particular tone of someone who has decided to treat an awkward thing as if it were perfectly ordinary. "I see you have found other accommodation." "Mr. Whitfield," she said. She did not stand up from the porch chair. She was not going to do him the discourtesy of pretending she was glad to see him, and she was not going to do herself the discourtesy of letting him think she was intimidated. "What brings you out this way?" Before he could answer, there were footsteps from three different directions, simultaneously from the barn, and from around the side of the house, and from the workshop at the far end of the yard, and the Morrison brothers converged on the front of the house, with the unhurried, unstaged precision of men who have known each other their entire lives and do not need to plan this kind of thing in advance. Cade came from the barn, Reed from the side of the house, Flint from the workshop, wiping his hands on a cloth, though he did not look particularly concerned about getting them clean. There was no aggression in how they positioned themselves. No theater. They simply arrived, three large men standing in front of their house looking at the visitor. The effect, however, was very clear. Cade looked at Whitfield with those level amber eyes. "Aldous." "Cade." Whitfield's voice stayed smooth. He had clearly done this before the patient, reasonable negotiator settling in for another round. "I wanted to follow up on my last letter. I believe my most recent figure was more than fair." "The answer is the same as it has always been." "I understand that has been your position." Whitfield smiled, and it was a very good smile, practiced and warm in a way that did not reach his eyes at all. "I thought perhaps the conversation might benefit from being had in person rather than through correspondence." "It would not," Cade said. There was a silence. Whitfield's horse shifted slightly. One of the hired men behind Whitfield moved his hand to rest it on the saddle horn, which was a casual gesture that was not entirely casual. And then Whitfield looked at Eleanor. Not quickly, not glancingly. He looked at her with deliberate and careful attention long enough to make clear that he intended to be noticed looking. And he said in a voice pitched to carry to all of them, "It would be a shame if the good people of Cedar Ridge developed the wrong impression about the situation up here. A young woman, three unmarried men, no proper chaperone or arrangement of record." He let the silence sit for exactly a beat. "People do talk, Miss Harper, in small towns especially. They always have." It was very well done. Eleanor had to acknowledge that. It was not a threat anyone could point to as a threat. It was simply an observation phrased with concern, delivered with the regretful air of a man who only mentions such things because someone has to. It put nothing on record. It left everything in the air. She saw Flint take a step forward. She saw Reed put a hand on his shoulder without looking at him, the practiced automatic gesture of an older brother who has done it 1,000 times. She saw Cade Morrison not move at all, not a muscle, not a change of expression, just that steady amber regard that she was beginning to understand was its own form of communication. "Get off my land, Aldous," Cade said. The voice was level and quiet and carried the absolute weight of a man who means exactly what he says and has said everything he intends to say. Whitfield smiled once more, brief and controlled. He touched the brim of his hat to Eleanor in a gesture that managed to be both courteous and insulting. In the same movement, turned his horse and rode away. His two men followed without a word. They stood and watched the three riders diminish down the ranch road toward the valley. No one spoke for a moment. The mountain wind moved through the grass in the yard and then was still. "He will not let it go," Reed said quietly to no one in particular. Cade did not respond to that directly. He turned and looked at Eleanor on the porch, a straight, considering look, and in the amber eyes she saw something she had not seen there before. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. An acknowledgement of some kind. As if he was seeing her in this moment, not as a problem to be managed or a circumstance to be accommodated, but as a person who had sat on his porch while a man threatened her reputation and had not flinched. Then he turned and went back toward the barn because there was work to be done and the day was still moving. Eleanor picked up the correspondence she had set down and looked at it without seeing it for a moment. She was beginning to understand the shape of what she had walked into. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to know that it was larger than it had looked from the outside and more complicated, and that she was already standing in the middle of it, whether she had chosen to be or not. She had come here on the word of a man who had discarded her without a second thought. She had ended up in the house of a man whose land that same person had been trying to acquire for over a year. She had found maps and letters that suggested the northern pasture of this ranch was worth far more than its acreage, that whoever held it held something that shaped the life of every farm in the lower valley. She had watched three brothers stand together in front of their house without a word of coordination between them, presenting a quiet, immovable solidarity to a man who used the suggestion of social damage as a weapon. And she had a child's hand tucked into hers most of the morning, and a stack of firewood beside her stove that no one had mentioned, and a song that made thunder less frightening. None of this was what she had planned. It was not even close to what she had planned. But Eleanor Harper had been raised by people who believed that what mattered most was not where you intended to go, but what you did with where you actually were. She set down the correspondence, stood up from the porch chair, and went inside to start supper. The mountains outside the kitchen window were turning purple and rose, in a deep impossible orange in the last of the day, and the smell coming through the gaps around the window frame was that cold, clean mineral thing she still did not have a name for. And somewhere down the hall, Clara was singing something tuneless and happy to Mr. Buttons, and the fire in the kitchen stove was warming the room from its cold corners outward. Eleanor Harper had $32 in a single leather satchel. She had a job she had not expected, and a room she had not planned on, and a set of questions she did not yet have answers to. She had a little girl who checked on sad people because her mother had taught her to, and three men who had stood between her and a threat without being asked. She did not know what any of it added up to. Not yet, but she was beginning to think she might stay long enough to find out. 3 weeks is not a long time. It is not long enough to learn a new country or to fully understand the rhythms of a family that has been operating without outside observation for years, or to know with any certainty what kind of person you are dealing with when that person has spent a significant portion of their adult life practicing the discipline of not being known easily. 3 weeks is barely long enough to learn where things are kept in an unfamiliar kitchen, or to understand which floorboards creak at which points in the night, or to figure out that the barn cat, a large gray animal with the personality of a retired judge, would tolerate being approached from the left but not the right, and would make his feelings about the right very clear. And yet, 3 weeks is long enough for certain things to begin, for patterns to establish themselves, for a child to stop saying good morning with the formal politeness she extends to new people and start saying it the way she says it to people who belong in her mornings, for a house to begin the slow process of adjusting to a new presence within it, the way a river adjusts to a new stone on its bed, not dramatically, not all at once, but continuously and in a direction that is ultimately irreversible. Eleanor Harper had been at Morrison Ranch for 3 weeks when she began to understand that she was no longer waiting for the situation to resolve itself into something temporary. She had stopped doing that somewhere in the second week, though she could not have identified the exact moment. She had simply woken up one morning and noticed that she was thinking about the winter supply inventory, with the kind of ownership you only bring to problems that are genuinely yours, and understood from that observation that something had already shifted in her without asking her permission first. She was not yet sure what to do with that understanding, but she was honest enough to have it. The work was real, and there was a great deal of it. The accounting alone represented months of neglect, not carelessness. On Cade's part, she had revised that initial judgment quickly, but the inescapable consequence of a man managing 2,000 acres of productive land, a cattle operation, and a 5-year-old child with 2 brothers whose strengths did not particularly run toward administrative record-keeping. She had rebuilt the filing system from its foundations, created a ledger that actually balanced organized 2 years of land records into something that could be produced and read by a third party without requiring an expedition to find any specific document, and had begun corresponding on the ranch's behalf with the grain supplier in Denver, whose invoices had been sent to the wrong address for the better part of a year. Cade noticed. He said nothing about it directly because noticing things directly was not how Cade Morrison operated. But on the morning that she placed the newly organized accounts on his desk and showed him in approximately 4 minutes the current financial state of the operation as opposed to the guessed-at version he had been working from, he looked at the ledger for a long moment and then looked at her with something in his face that she was learning to identify as the closest he came to open appreciation. "This is good work," he said. That was all he said. But she understood that it was not a small thing coming from him. The three brothers were three separate studies, and she approached all of them with the careful observational habits she had developed working among lawyers who were themselves a population of people who said what they meant only in specific and controlled circumstances and communicated the rest through implication and omission. Flint was the most immediate challenge and also the simplest one once she understood what he was doing. He was not hostile, he was testing. There was a clear distinction between the two, though. From the outside, they could look the same. In his first week with Eleanor in the house, Flint argued with nearly every organizational decision she made, questioned her estimates on supply costs, disputed the logic of her correspondence schedule, and on one occasion spent approximately 20 minutes explaining why her method of organizing the grain receipts was inferior to a method she strongly suspected he had invented on the spot, specifically for the purpose of this argument. She did not apologize. She did not soften her positions. She presented her reasoning in the same way she would have presented it to a difficult client at the law firm, with the quiet, steady authority of someone who has done the work and is not moved by the volume or persistence of disagreement. When the argument about the grain receipts reached its natural conclusion, which was that her method was correct and demonstrably more efficient, Flint looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. He did not apologize either. He simply nodded once in the way of a person who has confirmed something they wanted to know and went off to do something else. The next morning, he brought her coffee without being asked and set it on the corner of the desk without ceremony. And that was the end of the testing period. From then on, Flint Morrison treated Eleanor Harper with the particular respect of someone who has established through adversarial means that you are not a person who will fold under pressure, which in his worldview was the only kind of respect worth having. On the day he placed the entire year's financial records on her desk and said without looking at her that she was better at this than the man they had hired from Denver, she understood that she had been fully admitted to Flint Morrison's roster of people he considered worth his honest attention. It was she had come to understand not a small list, but entry to it was not free. Reed was a different matter and a different kind of satisfaction. He talked to her the way people talk when they genuinely want to know what another person thinks, asking her questions about Philadelphia and the law firm and what she had read recently with the alert, interested quality of a man who had been living with two people whose interior lives he already knew very well and found a new mind arriving at his table genuinely interesting. He was the one who eventually told her about Margaret not as gossip, not as warning, but as something he thought she needed to know in order to understand the place she was in.
They were repairing fence line on the eastern pasture, a Saturday task that Reed had taken on himself and that Eleanor had offered to help with because she was curious about the land, and because 4 walls and a ledger book was not the entirety of what she intended to be. She held boards while he nailed a simple division of labor that required enough concentration to make silence comfortable and enough repetition to make conversation natural. "She would have liked you," Reed said, setting a nail against the wood without looking up. "Margaret. She was practical the way you are, not cold, just clear about what was real and what was not." He drove the nail with 2 measured strikes. "She used to say that kindness without sense is just sentimentality, dressed up to look generous." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Eleanor said. "She was." He lined up the next nail. "Cade hasn't talked about her since the funeral. Not once, not to either of us. He thinks that carrying something in silence means he is keeping it safe." A pause while he worked. "He does not understand that silence and keeping are different things." Eleanor said nothing to this. She held the board steady and let Reed's words settle where they would, because some things do not benefit from being commented on directly. They worked on for a while, the rhythm of the task filling the space where words had been. The wind moved through the dry grass of the eastern pasture, and the mountains to the west caught the afternoon light in a way that made the whole landscape look temporarily made of copper. Eleanor set the next board in place and held it steady while Reed drove the nail, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "She would have liked you," Reed said again, and this time there was something different in it. Something that was not entirely about Margaret, or not only about Margaret and Eleanor, who had learned to hear the things people said inside the things they said heard it clearly. She did not respond to it. She simply held the board steady while he drove the next nail, and when he straightened up and moved to the following post, they both let the moment pass, the way people do when they have understood each other, and understand also that some things are better left in the place where they were almost said. What she was learning about Cade Morrison, she was learning the way you learn the geography of a country with no maps. Through observation, through small things, through what was present, and through what was conspicuously absent. He was up before dawn every day without exception, out to the barn and the animals, before the house was fully light, managing the daily operations of the ranch, with the quiet, unrelenting competence of a man who has internalized responsibility so completely that he no longer experiences it as a choice. He came in at mealtimes. He was present for Clara's evenings, sitting with her while she talked herself through her day, answering her questions with the full seriousness she deserved, reading to her on the nights she asked for it, in the particular low, steady voice that was apparently the designated reading voice, a tone Eleanor heard once through a half-open door and found that she could not immediately walk away from. He spoke to Eleanor directly when the work required it. He deferred to her judgment on household and accounting matters, without making an issue of the deferral. When she offered an opinion, he disagreed with he said so plainly and without heat, and when her reasoning convinced him, he said so with equal plainness. He was not a man who performed, but he was also a man who had built walls, and had been building them long enough that he no longer experienced them as walls. He experienced them as the ordinary shape of himself. She saw it in the way he stopped a sentence, sometimes the way a sentence would be moving in one direction, and then arrive at a door that was kept closed and redirect itself. She saw it in the way he looked at Clara sometimes, when the child was laughing at something Flint had done, a look of such concentrated love and such careful restraint that Eleanor had to look away from it, because it felt like seeing something private. She was not going to pretend she did not notice, but she was also not going to press on something that was not hers to press on. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. She had not decided. It was on the 15th day, a Tuesday afternoon, with the sky outside going the particular deep blue of Colorado October, at 2 o'clock, that she opened the storage room off the kitchen in order to reorganize its shelving, and found the box. It was not hidden exactly. It was pushed to the back of the lowest shelf behind a row of canning jars in the way that things are placed when someone put them there to be out of sight, but not with any particular intention of concealing them from anyone who might look. A small wooden box, plain pine, with a simple latch. On the lid in pencil 2 lines in a handwriting she did not recognize. A woman's handwriting, careful and clear. "For the woman who comes after me." Eleanor stood in the storage room doorway for a long moment. The afternoon light came in low through the kitchen window, touching the jars on the shelves and the surface of the box with the same flat, neutral illumination it gave to everything else in the room. The house was quiet around her. Flint was out on the far pasture. Reed had gone to town for supplies. Clara was asleep upstairs, which she still did at this age on certain afternoons, deeply and completely, as if rest were a serious project. She could hear the wind along the outside wall. She could hear the tick of the stove settling in the kitchen. She set the box back where she had found it and closed the storage room door. She stood in the hallway for a full minute before she could make herself walk away. It was only later, lying in her room that night, with the lamp turned low and the fire in the small grate burning down, that she placed together what had been sitting separately at the back of her mind. Clara at the station saying Mama always said, and then that other thing the question asked with such specific weight. Did Mama send you? She had answered honestly that she did not know, and Clara had accepted that answer with a nod that treated it as something other than no. Now, the box in the storage room had given that question a new context, had made it feel less like the random wondering of a child, and more like something that had a shape to it, that pointed in a direction she could not yet fully see. She put the lamp out and lay in the dark, and listened to the mountain wind, and did not reach any conclusions. But she remembered the handwriting on the lid of the box, careful and clear. For the woman who comes after me. She did not sleep well that night. The town's opinion of Eleanor Harper had been forming in her absence, which is the way town opinions always form, through conversation and inference, and the particular creative license that boredom extends to speculation. Cedar Ridge was a proper settlement with proper institutions and proper social structures, and one of those social structures was the machinery by which a community processes the arrival of an unusual circumstance. A young woman from Philadelphia brought out by Aldous Whitfield, and then evidently rejected, now living and working at Morrison Ranch with 3 unmarried men. This was by any reasonable measure an unusual circumstance. She first understood the shape of what was being said about her on a Wednesday, in the 3rd week when she went into town with Clara to purchase thread and lamp oil and a few other household items from the general store. The trip had been pleasant up to that point, Clara narrating the journey with the thoroughness of someone who considered no detail of the landscape too small to be shared with a companion, pointing out specific trees and particular rocks, and one fence post that Flint had once kicked in a moment of frustration, and that she considered historically significant. The store was busy with the midday crowd. Eleanor paid it no particular attention at first. She was focused on the list she had written out, moving through the aisles with the efficiency of someone who has a clear task and intends to complete it. It was beeswax that she was examining when she became aware of the specific quality of silence that had settled around her. Not a total silence, the store was still full of its ordinary sounds, but a directed one. The kind that happens when conversation near you has stopped being carried out and is now being conducted at a lower register for an audience that is not you. She raised her eyes. 2 women she did not know were standing near the dry goods shelf, and they were looking at her with the particular expression that requires no translation. It was not hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was the expression of people who have already made up their minds about something, and are now simply collecting evidence to support the conclusion they have already reached. Clara took Eleanor's hand at that moment, as if she had felt the change in atmosphere before she had consciously registered it, the way children sometimes absorb the emotional temperature of a room through some faculty that adults have learned not to rely on. "They are acting strange," Clara said quietly, in the way she said things that were simply true and not yet explained. Eleanor pressed the child's hand gently. "Sometimes people act strange when they only have part of the information," she said. "That is why information matters." She paid for what she needed, thanked the man at the counter with the same directness she would have used if the room had been full of people glad to see her, and took Clara out into the clean October air. But on the walk home with Clara, chattering again about the fence post and other monuments of local history, Eleanor was doing something else simultaneously, running through what she had observed in the store with the analytical clarity she applied to everything that seemed important. Someone had been talking. The content of what was being said was not difficult to infer, and the source of it required only a moment's consideration. Aldous Whitfield had weapons, and she was beginning to understand that the sharpest one was not money or legal pressure, or the physical suggestion of his hired men. It was the social fabric of a small town, in which he had been a significant figure for years, and the ease with which he could use that fabric to work damage on people he wanted moved. She could not fight that with indignation or denials. Indignation was exactly the reaction it was designed to provoke, and denials are structurally weaker than accusations in the economy of small-town gossip. What she could fight it with was evidence carefully gathered correctly, presented in the appropriate venue. She needed to understand exactly what Whitfield had, what he needed, and what he had done. She had pieces of it from the documents she had already found. She needed the rest. She spent the following 3 evenings working through the accumulated records in the office with a more specific attention than she had brought to the initial organizing. Not just sorting, but reading, following threads, cross-referencing dates. She worked after supper when Clara was in bed and the brothers had retired to their various evening occupations in the small, warm room, with the lamp turned up and the ledger books open around her. She found the offer letters confirmed and extended. There were also 2 conversations documented in a log that Kate had apparently kept for legal purposes, dates and summaries of direct approaches each refused. There was a surveyor's report ordered by someone and then apparently forgotten in the files that assessed the water production capacity of the Northern Spring at figures that made Eleanor stop and read the page twice. The numbers were substantial, more than substantial. The water that came off that particular section of the Morrison property fed not just the dozen farms in the lower valley, but also the municipal water infrastructure that Cedar Ridge itself had built 3 years ago in anticipation of expansion. Whoever held that land held something the town itself needed. Then, in a folder filed under the mundane heading of Correspondence Miscellaneous, she found the document she had not been looking for. It was a contract. Not a draft, not a proposal. A signed contract with a date between Aldous Whitfield, identified as seller, and the Colorado Mining and Development Company, identified as buyer for the right of access to and extraction from the mineral and water resources of the northern section of a property, described by its coordinates, which she recognized immediately as Morrison Ranch's northern pasture. The contract was dated April 1873, 6 months ago. The purchase price listed was considerable. The deposit already paid, according to the attached receipt, was $4,000. The transfer deadline was written in clear language at the bottom of the last page. Spring of 1874, 6 months from now. Eleanor sat very still for a moment with the document in her hands. The pressure Whitfield was applying to Morrison Ranch was not ambition. It was desperation dressed in the clothes of ambition. He had sold land he did not own, taken money he had not earned, and made a legal commitment to a company large enough to have its own lawyers. Every action he had taken in the past 6 months, the escalating offers, the visit to the ranch, the gossip campaign, the formal complaint to the sheriff, all of it mapped cleanly onto the timeline of a man running out of room. She placed the document back in the folder and sat with what she knew. She was holding evidence that could unravel Aldous Whitfield's position entirely. Any competent legal authority presented with these documents would understand within 10 minutes what had happened and what it required. She needed to take them to Sheriff Beckett. She needed to do it correctly, which meant alone, and in the morning before Whitfield could move again. She needed to do it as herself, not as a representative of the Morrison family, because the narrative had to be clear. This was not 3 ranchers using their position to fight a land dispute. This was a woman who could read a contract finding evidence of fraud in documents she had been legitimately asked to manage. She had learned from 3 years in a law office that the story you tell about evidence matters as much as the evidence itself. She was still sitting with that question when the storm came. It arrived at the kind of hour that suggests nature has no particular interest in human convenience. After midnight, the sky, which had been cold and clear at supper time, announced itself with the kind of thunderclap that does not build gradually, but simply arrives a single enormous sound that seemed to compress the air in the house. Rain followed immediately heavy and driven sideways by wind, and then hail, irregular and vicious rattling against the roof, with enough force to wake anyone who was sleeping lightly. Eleanor was not sleeping. She was at her desk with the lamp low, thinking about the contract in the cabinet, when the storm began. She listened to it for a moment. Then she heard something else, much closer, the sound of a door. She was in the hall before she had fully decided to go there. Clara's room was empty. The bed covers pushed back the window above the small desk open 2 inches, where the latch had not caught properly. The curtain was moving with the cold air coming through. She did not stop to wake anyone. There was no time for the explanation that waking someone required. She pulled on her coat and boots at the door and went out into the storm. The hail had moved past, but the rain was still hard and the wind was substantial, and the darkness outside was the total, rural darkness of a place without gaslight or neighboring windows, relieved only by the occasional white flash of lightning that made the whole landscape visible for an instant, and then vanished. She could not see more than a few feet in front of her. She went toward the back of the house, because Clara had mentioned the apple tree behind the smokehouse more than once, because children go where they have been comfortable before, when the night frightens them, because that is what she would have done. She found Clara under the tree. The child was crouched at the base of the trunk, Mr. Buttons held against her chest with both arms, her nightgown soaked through her hair, plastered flat against her head. She was not crying. She was very still and very small and very cold. "I came to find you," Eleanor said simply, crouching down to Clara's level. "I was scared," Clara said. Her teeth were making a small, involuntary sound. "I know. I have you now." She took off her coat and wrapped it around the child, lifting her as she stood settling Clara's weight against her chest and shoulder, the way she had watched Cade do, and walked back toward the house through the rain. Clara's arms went around her neck and stayed there, and the child's wet hair was cold against Eleanor's cheek, and the rain was running down the back of her collar, and none of that mattered in the slightest. She pushed through the back door and into the kitchen. Cade Morrison was standing in the hallway. He had a lamp in his hand, and he had clearly come from his room, because he was not fully dressed for the outdoors, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been controlling himself very carefully since he woke to a storm and discovered his daughter's room empty, which is to say it was a tightly held mask over something that was not controlled at all. In the lamplight, his face was all shadow and sharp angle, and his eyes, those amber eyes, found Eleanor and Clara in the kitchen doorway, and for one moment, one single moment, the mask was entirely absent. What was underneath it was not a complicated thing. It was simply what a parent's face looks like when the specific terror that belongs only to parents, the cold particular dread of something happening to the person they cannot survive losing, is replaced in an instant by relief. He crossed the kitchen without speaking and took Clara from Eleanor's arms, not urgently, not grabbing, with great care. He held the child against him, and Clara tucked her head under his chin, and he stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Eleanor.
She was standing in his kitchen wet through her coat, gone, her hair running water onto the floor, her dress ruined for the evening and possibly beyond, and she was looking back at him with the direct, steady quality that he was beginning to understand was simply the way Eleanor Harper looked at everything, without pretense or deflection, as if the world was something to be seen clearly rather than interpreted safely. He set Clara down carefully and went to the linen shelf in the hallway and came back with a large blanket that was kept there and placed it around Eleanor's shoulders. He did not make ceremony of it. He simply put it there. "You should warm up," he said. His voice was what it always was, low and level, but there was something underneath it that was different, a rougher texture, as if the usual control was present but had been recently tested. "I will stay with her the rest of the night." Eleanor nodded. She started toward the hallway. "Eleanor," she turned. He was standing with Claire in his arms again, the child already heavy with the return of sleep, and he was looking at her with the amber eyes that she had been studying for 3 weeks and had not fully read. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, short and simple, and offered with the directness of someone who does not say things they do not mean, which meant that from Cade Morrison those 2 words carried the weight of a much longer sentence. She went to her room and changed into dry clothes and sat by the small fire until it burned low, and she was warm again, and she thought about the expression on his face in the kitchen doorway the moment before the mask came back, and about the blanket placed around her shoulders without ceremony, and about what Reed had told her at the fence line. He carries things in silence. He thinks silence means keeping them safe. In the morning, she would go back to the documents. In the morning, there were decisions to be made and actions to be taken. There was a contract in the filing cabinet that needed to reach the right hands, and a man in the valley below who was running out of time and becoming more dangerous as that deadline approached, and a family on this hillside that was standing between him and what he needed, possibly without fully understanding what they were standing against. All of that was real, and all of it required her attention. But in the chair beside the small fire, with the blanket from the hallway shelf still around her shoulders, Eleanor sat for a while longer than was strictly necessary before she went to bed. Harlan Beckett arrived on a Wednesday morning not quite 2 weeks after the storm, which put Eleanor's time at Morrison Ranch at something close to 5 weeks in total. He came alone, which was a sign that he was treating this as a conversation rather than an official call, though the distinction between the two was not as comfortable as it might have been. Eleanor was on the porch when his horse came up the ranch road. She recognized him from the brief glimpse she had had of him in the general store during her first week in town. A solid, deliberate man in his middle 50s with a sheriff's star that he wore as if he had forgotten it was there, the way a man wears something he has carried long enough to stop noticing. He had the face of someone who had made a career of distinguishing between what people said and what was actually true, and had gotten reasonably good at it. Cade came from the barn. Reed appeared from somewhere. Flint materialized from the workshop, which seemed to be where he went when he needed to do something with his hands and was thinking about something else simultaneously. The three of them stood at the foot of the porch steps with the quality of men who do not need to discuss their positioning. Beckett looked at Cade. "Got a letter," he said. "Felt you should know about it before I decided what to do." He produced the letter from his coat pocket. Eleanor did not reach for it. She watched Cade take it, watched him read it, standing there on the porch steps, his face doing nothing visible, the way his face did nothing visible when he was processing something he needed to think about before he reacted to it. She knew what it said, or near enough. She had been expecting something of this kind since Whitfield's visit to the ranch, since the quality of the silence in the general store, since the particular trajectory of a man who had run out of gentle options and was now reaching for a different kind of tool. Cade handed the letter to Reed, who read it, and handed it to Flint, who read it with a stillness that was somehow more alarming than movement would have been. Then Flint placed the letter on the porch railing and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of someone managing something carefully. "You know this is Whitfield," Cade said to Beckett. "Not a question." "I know what it looks like," Beckett said, "but I have a written complaint and a name attached to it, and I cannot simply ignore it. I need to ask." A pause. "Is there anything improper happening up here, Cade? I need to hear you say it." Cade looked at the sheriff with the level, undeflected amber gaze that meant he was about to say exactly what was true and expected it to be sufficient. "Miss Harper came to Cedar Ridge in difficult circumstances through no fault of her own. She has worked at this ranch doing bookkeeping and household work. She has a private room and her own arrangements. My brothers and I have treated her with every courtesy a decent woman deserves." He paused, and then, "If Aldous Whitfield wants to suggest otherwise, the appropriate place for that suggestion is to my face, not through your office." Beckett looked at him for a moment, then at Eleanor, then back at Cade. "That is what I thought," he said. "I will file accordingly." He started to turn his horse, then stopped. "Cade, whatever Whitfield is after, he is moving faster than he was. You ought to be thinking about why that is." He rode back down the ranch road toward town. Eleanor watched him go. She picked up the letter from the porch railing, read it, and set it back down without a word. The language was careful and plausible, and designed to be difficult to disprove, the product of a man who understood that formal accusations require a veneer of reasonableness to gain traction. A woman of questionable background, irregular living arrangements, concerns about the well-being of a child in such an environment. It was well done in a technical sense, and it told her something important about the timing. Whitfield was applying formal pressure now. The informal campaign through gossip had not produced results quickly enough, and so he had escalated to documented complaint. That meant he was feeling the urgency of his deadline in a way he had not felt it before. She became aware that Cade was looking at her. She turned. He was standing at the porch rail with that quality he occasionally had of looking at something with full attention as opposed to the partial attention most people bring to most things. He was looking at her the way he looked at the mountain lion on mornings when he was thinking about the weather fully and without pretense. "You heard it," he said. "I heard it. It does not change anything on this end." "I know," she said. "That is why I am still standing here." Something shifted in the amber eyes. Not dramatically. Nothing about Cade Morrison happened dramatically. But there was a change, the subtle recalibration of a man who has revised a calculation without showing his work, and she filed it alongside the other things she was keeping. That night after supper, after Clara was in bed, after Reed and Flint had retired to their respective corners of the evening, Eleanor went back to the office. She moved through the filing cabinet with the specific efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and where it is. She pulled the contract from the miscellaneous folder and spread it on the desk alongside the deposit receipt and the original surveyor's report and the offer letters with Cade's refusals penciled in the margins. She arranged these documents in order of relevance and looked at them with the trained eye of someone who had spent 3 years working for men whose profession was understanding how pieces of paper become power in the right hands and how they become liability in the wrong ones. The picture was complete. Every element was present. The contract, the money, the deadline, the refused offers, the legal description of property Whitfield had sold before he owned it. She needed to take these documents to Sheriff Beckett. She needed to do it correctly, which meant alone and in the morning before Whitfield could move again. She needed to do it as herself, not as a representative of the Morrison family, because the narrative had to be clear. This was not 3 ranchers using their position to fight a land dispute. This was a woman who could read a contract, finding evidence of fraud in documents she had been legitimately asked to manage. She had learned from 3 years in a law office that the story you tell about evidence matters as much as the evidence itself. She sat with the documents until the lamp began to run low, organizing her thoughts into the precise sequence she would use in the morning. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the darkness with the particular sound it made at this elevation, not quite howling, not quite sighing, something between the two that had no good word for it in any language she knew. She could hear the house settle around her, the tick of cooling wood in the walls. From the far end of the hall, the deep and even breathing of the occupied rooms. And then, from outside, the familiar sound of boots on the porch boards, the deliberate, unhurried stride that went around the house each night in the last hour. The final inspection, the habit of a man who had taken responsibility for this place and the people in it so completely that he performed its nightly security with the same automatic faithfulness he brought to everything else. The footsteps went along the south side of the house and then around to the back, and then she heard them slow as they passed the office window, where the light of her lamp was visible through the glass. They slowed and held in the same way they had held in the hallway on her first night when she had been singing to Clara. They held for longer than a man needs to stand outside a lighted window for any practical reason. Then they continued and turned the corner and faded toward the barn. Eleanor looked at the office door, then at the window, then at the documents on the desk in front of her. In the morning she would go to town. She would lay out what she had found in language that Sheriff Beckett could act on. She would do it correctly, and she would do it alone, because that was the only way to do it that served everyone in this house, including the man who walked the perimeter each night, making sure everything was in order. She gathered the documents into a neat stack and placed them in the leather folder she had been using for important correspondence, fastened the clasp, set it by the door where she would not forget it in the morning. Then she turned down the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark of the office, listening to the wind outside and the silence of the house around her. Somewhere between Philadelphia and this small room in the foothills of the Rockies, Eleanor Harper had stopped measuring time in terms of how long it had been since things went wrong. She was measuring it in something else now, something she did not yet have a name for. But it had the quality of moving towards something rather than away from something, and that she was finding was a considerable difference. She picked up the leather folder and went to bed. Tomorrow she would begin the work of ending this. She left before the house was fully light. Not secretly. She told no one because waking someone requires explanation, and explanation requires time. And the thing she needed most on this particular morning was to be standing in front of Harlan Beckett's desk, before Aldous Whitfield had finished his breakfast and begun making decisions about his day. She dressed in the dark, took the leather folder from the desk where she had placed it the night before, and walked out into the thin, pre-dawn cold of a Colorado October morning, with the particular calm of someone who has made a decision and moved past the making of it. The road down from Morrison Ranch into Cedar Ridge took 40 minutes on foot at a steady pace. She had made the walk twice before, once with Clara to the general store, once alone, to post correspondence, and she had used both occasions to learn the road as she learned everything carefully and with attention. The way it wound first north and then dropped west toward the valley floor. The stand of cottonwoods at the second bend that would have turned gold by now if the first hard frost had come. The point where the mountains to the east caught the earliest light and threw it sideways across the valley in long flat bands that made the whole country look briefly like something painted rather than real. She walked it now in the gray pre-dawn with the leather folder under her arm, and her thoughts in the specific ordered state she could produce when something important needed to be done and done correctly. At the law firm on Callaway Street, she had developed the habit of rehearsing. Not scripting, there was a difference, but rehearsing the structure of what needed to be communicated, the sequence of facts in the order that made their relationship clear, the precedents that would be recognized, the language that reduced the possibility of misinterpretation. She had been good at it. Her employer, a taciturn man named Hessler, who did not praise casually, had told her once that she had the clearest legal mind of any secretary he had ever employed, and then had immediately looked uncomfortable at having said something that generous and gone back to his desk. She used that habit now. Facts in sequence. What the document was, what it established, what it meant legally for the land claim, what it meant practically for the pressure being applied to Morrison Ranch, what the correct authority could do with it, and what timeline was available. By the time she reached the edge of town, she had run through it twice and was satisfied with the structure. The sun was just clearing the mountain peaks to the east, and the main street of Cedar Ridge was in that state of early morning that belongs to working towns. Before the working day begins, a single lamp burning in the bakery window, the livery stable open but quiet, a man loading a wagon outside the hardware store who raised a hand in the universal morning acknowledgement of someone who does not yet have the energy for words. Harlan Beckett's office was in the courthouse building at the far end of the main block. The light was on inside when she got there, which she had counted on because a sheriff in a county with active land disputes does not have the luxury of sleeping past dawn. She knocked once and went in. Beckett was at his desk with a cup of coffee and a document he set face down. When she came through the door, the automatic discretion of a man accustomed to the confidential nature of his work. He looked at her, then at the leather folder, then back at her with the expression of someone who was revising his assessment of what kind of morning this was going to be. "Miss Harper," he said, "you are out early." "I am," she agreed. She sat down in the chair across the desk without waiting to be invited, placed the folder on the desk, and opened it. "I need about 15 minutes of your attention. I think what I have found is something you will want to see before the day gets further along." Beckett looked at this document she placed in front of him. He was a man who read carefully and without interrupting, which she appreciated. He went through the contract first, then the deposit receipt, then the surveyor's report, then the offer letters with Cade's refusals in the margins. He read each document fully before moving to the next, and his face did not change in any significant way, which meant he was experienced enough at this kind of thing to let himself process it before he reacted to it. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at her. "Where did you find these?" "In the Morrison Ranch filing cabinet. In the course of organizing the ranch's administrative records, which I was employed to do. They were filed under miscellaneous correspondence. I do not believe Cade Morrison had read them carefully. He receives a great deal of paper and has limited time to review it." Beckett nodded slowly. "And you understand what this contract means?" "I worked for 3 years in a law office that handled property cases," Eleanor said. "I understand what it means. Aldous Whitfield entered into a legally binding agreement to transfer property rights he did not possess and cannot legally convey. He accepted a deposit of $4,000 against that agreement. The deadline for delivery is spring of next year. That deadline and the money already spent explains every action he has taken in the past 6 months, including the letter he sent to your office." Beckett looked at the documents for another moment. Then he looked at Eleanor with the assessing quality of a man who has been in his profession long enough to recognize the difference between someone who is handing him a weapon and someone who is handing him a responsibility. He seemed to conclude correctly that she was doing the latter. "You understand," he said, "that bringing this to me means it becomes a formal matter. I cannot quietly make it go away for anyone, including the Morrisons." "I understand that," Eleanor said. "I would prefer a formal resolution. Quiet resolutions tend to leave things unfinished." Beckett almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more the facial suggestion of one, but it was there. "I will need you and the Morrison family at the town meeting Thursday," he said. "This needs to be handled in front of the community. Cedar Ridge is going to have questions, and those questions deserve public answers." "I agree," Eleanor said. She stood and gathered the folder. "I will leave copies of everything with you. The originals go back to the ranch files." She walked back up the road to Morrison Ranch in the full morning light with the mountains ahead of her, and the valley below her, and the cold air moving off the high peaks with the smell of pine and distance. She was aware of a quality in herself that she recognized as the particular steadiness that comes not from things being resolved, but from having done the correct thing in the correct way, which is its own form of peace, regardless of what comes next. When she came through the kitchen door, all three Morrison brothers were at the table. This was not usual. Cade was typically in the barn or the field by the time Reed started the morning coffee, and Flint operated on a schedule that bore little relationship to conventional meal times. That all three were seated at the kitchen table when she came in suggested that her absence had been noticed and discussed, and that the discussion had reached a conclusion that involved waiting for her. Clara was also there, sitting in her chair with Mr. Buttons on the table in front of her, eating a biscuit with the calm of someone who had been told to stay quiet and had decided to take that instruction seriously for approximately as long as she could manage. Eleanor set the leather folder on the counter and took off her coat. She poured herself coffee because she had walked 40 minutes each way before 7 in the morning, and she had earned it, and then she sat down at the table and told them what she had found, what she had done, and what was going to happen Thursday. She told it in order, clearly, without elaboration beyond what was useful. When she finished, the table was quiet for a moment. It was Flint who spoke first, which was perhaps predictable. "You walked into Beckett's office alone," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite accusation and not quite admiration, and was somewhere in the complicated country between those two things. "With evidence against Whitfield, before you told any of us." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Any particular reason you did not think to mention it first?" She looked at Flint. "Because if a Morrison had walked into Beckett's office with these documents, it would have looked like a land dispute being fought by the family whose land is at stake. Which it is, but that is not the story that serves everyone best. This needed to be a woman who found evidence of fraud in documents she was legitimately managing and brought it to the proper authority. That is a different story, a cleaner one." Flint looked at Reed. Reed did not look back at him because Reed was looking at Eleanor with the expression of someone whose existing assessment of a person has been confirmed and extended in a direction he finds satisfying. "She is right," Reed said simply. Flint sat back. He did not say she was right, but he also did not say anything else on the subject, and with Flint Morrison that was functionally equivalent. Then Eleanor looked at Cade. He had not said anything yet, which was not unusual. He was looking at her with the steady amber attention she had been learning to read, and what she read in it now was not one thing, but several things at once, something that might have been frustration held in careful check, alongside something that was recognizably closer to respect than frustration, alongside something underneath both of those that she was not yet going to name. "You should have told me before you went," he said. "You would have insisted on coming," she said. A pause. "Yes. And that would have been the wrong approach." Another pause longer. "Yes," he said again. The word had a different quality the second time. Not capitulation. Acknowledgement. There was a difference, and Cade Morrison operated very precisely in the space between those two things. Clara, who had been holding her silence with heroic effort, looked around the table and said, "Is Miss Eleanor in trouble?" "No," all three brothers said simultaneously, and Clara settled back with her biscuit, satisfied. Thursday arrived with a particular weight that important days carry, a thickness in the air, a sharpness in the light that might have been ordinary autumn clarity and might have been something the occasion imposed. Eleanor dressed with the same care she had brought to the walk to Beckett's office, the best of what she had available, not because she was performing anything, but because the occasion was real and deserved to be treated accordingly. The Morrison family came down from the ranch in the wagon together, all four of them, which was not the usual arrangement for a trip to town, and which Clara treated as a special occasion worthy of extended commentary on the scenery from the time they left the ranch to the time they arrived at the main street. Flint rode separately, as he generally did when given the option. The town meeting hall on the north side of the main block was full by the time they arrived. This was not surprising. Cedar Ridge was not a large town, and the combination of a public complaint involving the Whitfield family, a question about water rights that affected a significant portion of the valley's farms, and the particular human interest of a young woman from Philadelphia who had arrived under unusual circumstances and apparently done something that required Harlan Beckett to call a town meeting, was sufficient to draw nearly every adult resident who could manage to be there. Whitfield was already seated when they arrived. He was at the left side of the room near the front, accompanied by a lawyer who had the look of someone who had come from Denver on short notice and was not entirely happy about it. Whitfield himself was composed in the way of a man who has decided composure is the correct tactical choice and is executing it deliberately. He wore his usual suit coat, which looked as out of place in the meeting hall as it had looked on the ranch road, and he held his hat on his knee with both hands in a gesture that managed to suggest patient, reasonable concern. He looked at Eleanor when she came in. She met his eyes and looked away first, not because she was cowed, but because she had nothing to communicate to him and saw no reason to communicate it. He was not important to her in the way he imagined himself to be important to the situation. He was a problem in a document, and the document was already in Harlan Beckett's hands. The Morrisons sat on the right side of the room. Cade in the center, Reed on one side, Flint on the other, which was where they naturally arranged themselves in any situation that required them to present as a unit. Eleanor sat in the row directly behind them. Beside her, Mrs. Caldwell, who had appeared at Eleanor's side before she had found her seat and had sat down with the brisk, settled air of someone who has decided where they stand and intends for that to be visible. Mrs. Caldwell had come to find Eleanor 2 days before this, had knocked on the ranch house door and asked to speak with her, and had then delivered an apology that was brief and direct, in the way of someone who was not practiced at apologies, but had decided this one was necessary. She had listened to the wrong account of things. She said so. She was not interested in continuing to act on information that had turned out to be deliberately misleading. She said that too. Eleanor had accepted this with the directness it deserved, and they had parted on terms that were not quite friendship, but were the proper ground from which friendship might eventually grow. Beckett called the meeting to order and presented what he had. He was a good speaker in the sense that mattered most, which was that he organized information clearly and did not try to make it more interesting than it was, which meant that the people in the room who were actually paying attention understood exactly what they were hearing. The contract, the money, the deadline, the property described in the contract, and its relationship to the Morrison land. The legal implications of selling property rights one does not possess to a company that has paid a significant deposit against their delivery. The room listened. In Eleanor's experience, rooms full of people who share practical interests in the outcome of information listen differently than rooms full of people who are simply curious. The farmers in the back rows, the men who ran operations that drew from the same water source that the Morrison Northern Pasture controlled, were listening with the specific quality of people who are calculating consequences in real time. Whitfield's lawyer stood up before Beckett had finished and attempted to redirect the conversation toward the question of how these documents had come to be in the possession of a woman of, as he put it, uncertain origins and irregular living arrangements. He was competent and he was quick, and he phrased it well, and the room shifted slightly in the way rooms do when a skilled lawyer introduces a complication. Flint Morrison was on his feet immediately. He did not get far. Cade's hand was on his shoulder before he had drawn the breath to speak, and Flint, to his considerable credit, understood the signal and sat back down. His jaw was set in a way that suggested the restraint was costing him something, but he maintained it. Then Cade stood up. He did not stand up the way a man stands up when he is angry, or when he is performing confidence for an audience. He stood up the way he did everything with the quiet, total certainty of someone who is not worried about whether anyone agrees with him because he is not speaking for approval. He was speaking because something needed to be said, and he was the correct person to say it. Miss Eleanor Harper is employed at Morrison Ranch, he said, doing bookkeeping and administrative work that she was engaged to do when she arrived here with nowhere else to go through no fault of her own. She has done that work with more skill and more honesty than anyone we have had in that role before. She has conducted herself with complete propriety from the day she arrived. Anyone in this room who has been told otherwise was told something false. He paused, and the pause had the quality of a door being opened rather than closed. The documents she found were in our own files. She did not take anything that was not legitimately in her care. She read them, understood what they meant, and brought them to the appropriate authority. He looked at Beckett. That is what an honest person does with evidence of wrongdoing. I am not sure why it requires defending. The room was quiet in the way it gets quiet when something has been said that does not leave room for the immediate next thing to be anything other than agreement or open argument. And nobody in the meeting hall that morning appeared to be in the mood for open argument with Cade Morrison on a point where he was plainly and demonstrably correct. Beckett concluded his presentation. He announced that the matter was being formally referred to the Colorado Land Office and the Denver District Attorney for review, that the contract presented constituted a prima facie case requiring investigation, and that any further approaches to Morrison Ranch regarding the northern pasture should be considered legally inadvisable for the duration of that investigation. Aldous Whitfield stood up once briefly and said something in a measured voice about the importance of due process and the presumption of innocence, which was not wrong exactly, but which had the quality of a statement made for the record, rather than for the room, the kind of thing you say when you have already understood that the room has moved past you. He left through the side door. Not the front door through which he had entered with his Denver lawyer and his careful composure and his horse that cost more than most families in Cedar Ridge saw in a year. The side door which opened onto the alley between the meeting hall and the hardware store. It was a small thing, but small things in small towns are rarely actually small. Afterward, on the wide board steps of the meeting hall in the October afternoon light that was already angling toward the gold it became. In late afternoon, the three brothers stood together in the way they had stood at the station weeks ago, and in the front yard of the ranch, and in every situation that had required them to occupy the same space with the same intention. Reed and Flint flanking Cade, not perfectly aligned, not formally arranged, just present. Eleanor was speaking with Mrs. Caldwell a little distance away. Claire was sitting on the lowest step eating an apple that Reed had produced from his coat pocket at some point during the proceedings, because Reed Morrison was the kind of man who thought ahead about what a 5-year-old might need during a lengthy public meeting. Flint looked at his brothers and said with the directness that was his only mode, So, Reed agreed. A pause. Someone needs to say it, Flint said. It does not need to be said, Reed answered quietly. It is already obvious. Flint looked at Cade, who was watching Eleanor from across the steps with the careful, fully present attention he brought to things that mattered. Flint looked at that for a moment, then looked back at Reed with the expression of someone confirming what they already knew. You are all right, he asked his brother, and for once there was no edge in the question, just the genuine inquiry of a man asking after someone he has known his entire life. Reed watched Eleanor for a moment. She was laughing at something Mrs. Caldwell had said, a real laugh, one of the ones that moved through her whole face, and that she did not seem to know she was doing. Then he looked at Flint. There are things that matter more than what you want, he said. Clara needs who she needs. Cade has been carrying this long enough. A pause and something in his expression that was honest and resigned and at peace with itself all at once. And I am going to be fine. I always find my way. Flint held his brother's gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once in the way he acknowledged things that did not require further conversation. He looked at Cade. You know, he said, for the smartest of us, you took an extremely long time to get there. Cade did not respond to this, but something moved at the corner of his mouth that on another man's face might have been the beginning of a smile. On Cade Morrison's face, it was already more than he typically offered. Who is cooking supper? Flint said, returning to practicalities with the ease of a man for whom practicalities have always been the most comfortable territory. Not you, Reed said. Obviously not me, Flint said as if this had never been a serious possibility, and they walked down the steps together to collect Clara in the wagon. That evening after supper, after Clara had been tucked in with Mr. Buttons and the particular ceremony of the evening song after Reed had settled into the main room with his book, and Flint had gone out to the workshop to finish whatever he was making in there that he had declined to describe to anyone. Cade knocked on the doorframe of the office where Eleanor was putting the day's papers in order. She looked up. He had something in his hands. The small wooden box from the storage room. The pine box with the simple latch in the 2 lines in pencil on the lid. He set it on the desk and sat down in the chair across from her, which was not something he did. He stood in doorways. He crossed rooms when something required crossing. He did not sit in chairs in offices and look at things on desks. The fact that he was doing it now told her in the language she had been learning to read that this was deliberate, that he had decided something and was here because of the decision. Clara told me you found this, he said, and put it back. It was not mine to open, Eleanor said. He nodded, looking at the box. Margaret wrote it the last night she was conscious, he said. She asked me to put it somewhere safe. She said Clara would know when to give it. He was quiet for a moment. Clara has been asking me about it since you arrived. I told her it needed to wait. Eleanor looked at the box on the desk between them. I have not opened it either, Cade said. I knew what it said, not the words, but what it said. He looked at her, the amber eyes steady and without the layers of careful management they usually wore. Opening it meant accepting that she had thought ahead to this, to someone else being here. I was not ready to accept that. And now it has been 2 years, he said, and there is a woman sitting at that desk who walked down a mountain road alone this morning to do something that protected this family at some personal cost to herself, and who has been doing things like that since the second week she was here without asking for anything in return. He paused. I think Margaret knew what she was doing when she wrote it. I think she knew me well enough to know I would need to see it with my own eyes before I believed it. Eleanor picked up this box and opened the latch and lifted the lid. The letter was there folded once. She took it out and unfolded it and read it in the lamplight without speaking. It was not long. Margaret Morrison had written it when she was ill and tired and running short on the time she needed to say things that mattered, and she had used the time she had with the economy of someone who cannot afford to waste it. When Eleanor had read it through twice, she looked at Cade. She asked me to read it to you, she said. He said nothing. He simply looked at her. She read it aloud. Not all of it, not every word, but the parts that needed to reach him. The parts Margaret had clearly intended for exactly this moment. Do not be frightened of him. He carries things in silence because he trusts actions more than words. Watch what he does. It will always tell you more than what he says. Do not try to be me. There is no need, and it would not serve anyone. There is room in this family for everything I was, and everything you are, and everything Clara still needs to become. Love her well. Love him better. And tell him when the time is right that I said it has been long enough. She folded the letter and placed it on the desk. The room was quiet. The lamp made its small sound. From outside, the mountain wind moved along the wall of the house with the familiar low note it made at this hour. Cade looked at the letter for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it rarely did, which was nothing deliberate. The control was still there. It was not entirely gone. It would never be entirely gone. It was too deeply built into who he was. But it had been set aside in the way that things are set aside when they need to be, when something more important than habitual self-protection presents itself and demands to be attended to. She knew, Eleanor said quietly. She always knew things ahead of me, he said. The words were steady, and the voice was steady, and there was nothing in it that was performed. Just the plain truth of a man speaking about someone he had loved and missed and carried in silence for 2 years. Cade. He looked up. She says it has been long enough. The amber eyes held hers across the desk in the lamplight, and in them she could see more clearly than she had seen it in weeks of careful observation what had been behind the walls all along. It was not complicated. It was simply what it was, the particular and irreplaceable thing that exists between people who have recognized each other across all the careful distance they have put between themselves and the world. "I do not want you to leave," he said. "I have not wanted that since the second week. I want you to stay, not as hired help, and not because we need someone to do the accounts, though we do need that." A pause. "I want you to stay because this house is different with you in it, and Claire is different, and I am different. And I do not know how to be the kind of man who would let something true walk away because he is afraid of being wrong." Eleanor looked at this man in the chair across from her, the man who split wood without being asked and put it by her stove and never mentioned it, who stood in front of the entire town that morning and said what was true in the plain, undecorated way that was the only way he knew how to say anything, who walked the perimeter of his house each night in the dark making sure everything was in order, and who stood outside a lighted window sometimes and did not go in, and who had not opened a box. His wife left him for 2 years because opening it meant accepting that she had thought past the end of her own life to the life that would come after. "I have not wanted to leave since the second week either," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds something the way the moment before a long rain holds the smell of water before the water arrives. "Then stay," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." In the morning, Clara was at Eleanor's door before the sun had cleared the mountains. She came in without knocking, which was not technically correct, but which Eleanor had stopped trying to address because some habits were more valuable than the corrections of them. She climbed onto the foot of the bed and arranged herself in Mr. Button's with the efficient authority of someone who has a specific purpose for this visit. "Papa told me last night," Clara said without preamble, "that he asked you something important and that it went well." "He told you that, did he? He also told me that I could ask you something this morning if I wanted to." She looked at Eleanor with the serious, clear-eyed attention that Eleanor had first seen on a platform bench in October. "Do you want me to ask it?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I do." Clara put both of her small hands on Eleanor's shoulders, which required her to set Mr. Buttons down, which she did with the deliberateness of someone making space for something that matters. She looked straight into Eleanor's face with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to be indirect about the things she loves. "Can you be my mama?" she said. "Forever, because I love you. And Papa loves you too, even though he is not very good yet at saying it the right way." Eleanor looked at this child, the girl who had crossed a train station platform to check on a sad stranger because her mother had told her it cost nothing and was sometimes the exact thing a person needed, who had taken a grown woman's hand without asking permission and held it because she had decided it was the right thing to do, who had asked, standing in the October light with a worn bear in her arms, whether Mama had sent you and had accepted the honest answer that "I don't know," with the nod of someone who understood that "I don't know" is not the same as no, who had been right in the way that children are sometimes right about things that adults complicate past the point of clarity simply and completely and without qualification. "Yes, Clara," Eleanor said. "Forever." Clara nodded once with the satisfied air of someone who has confirmed what they already knew, and then picked up Mr. Buttons and climbed off the bed and walked to the door where she stopped and looked back. "I am going to tell Papa," she said. "And Reed and Flint." A brief pause. "Mr. Buttons already knows." Then she went down the hall at the particular fast walk of a child who has important news and considers running inside the house a rule rather than a law. Eleanor listened to the small feet going down the hallway, and then the sound of doors, and then Clara's voice carrying up from the floor below, announcing what needed to be announced to whoever would listen. A deep voice responded, low and warm in the register Eleanor had learned to identify as the one Cade used when he was talking to his daughter in the morning before the day's work had taken over. She sat in the quiet room with the mountains visible through the window lit gold and purple in the early light, and understood that this was what it felt like when the thing you had been afraid to want turned out to be exactly where you were. They were married in the first week of December before the deep snows came. The ceremony was in the Cedar Ridge Church, small and practical, a cold morning with frost on the windows and the wood stove at the back of the room, working hard to keep the air from being what it would have been without it. The minister was a plain-spoken man who did not add ceremony where none was needed, which suited everyone present. The witnesses were Reed and Flint and Clara, who wore a dress that Eleanor had made for her in secret over the previous 3 weeks working at it in the evenings after Clara was asleep. A simple thing in a pale lavender color that Clara had mentioned twice in passing, with the careful casualness of someone who is hoping without wanting to hope too obviously. When Clara saw the dress the morning of the wedding, she stood very still for a moment, and then said nothing at all for a full 15 seconds, which was the longest she had ever gone without speaking in Eleanor's experience. And then she put it on and walked to the mirror and looked at herself with an expression of complete and private satisfaction that Eleanor thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen. Mrs. Caldwell was there. Harlan Beckett was there, standing at the back with his hat in his hands and his star catching the candlelight. Several of the Valley farmers were there, men Eleanor had seen at the town meeting, men who now knew that Morrison Ranch and the water it sat above were going to continue to belong to the people who had always managed them fairly and well. When the minister asked Cade the question, he said the words in the quiet, unhurried way. He said everything that he meant completely. When the minister asked Eleanor, she looked at Cade first, and then at Clara standing at her side with Mr. Buttons held in one arm and lavender ribbons in her hair. And then she said the words with all the certainty of someone who has finished calculating and arrived at the only answer the numbers support. Clara did not wait for the minister to complete his closing sentence. She stepped forward and wrapped both arms around Eleanor's waist and pressed her face into the fabric of her dress and held on with the particular grip of a child who has been waiting for something for long enough that when it arrives, they want to be very sure it stays. And she said clearly enough for everyone in the small, cold church to hear it, "Mama Eleanor." Nobody had told her to say it. Nobody had suggested it or practiced it with her. It arrived the way true things arrive, without ceremony, without preparation, as the simple and obvious name for what was real. The winter was cold and complete the way Colorado winters are, the kind that closes the high passes and turns the ranch road to packed ice and reduces the world to the immediate, to the warmth of the house and the animals in the barn and the daily work of keeping everything alive and in order. They were well stocked. Eleanor had seen to that in October and November. The supply list she had drawn up and the orders she had placed and the careful accounting of what the winter would require, based on the records she had spent weeks organizing. Kate had looked at her final inventory list and then at her and said without apparent awareness that it was a remarkable thing to say that the ranch had never gone into a winter this well prepared. She learned things about the inside of that life that she had not been able to learn from the outside. The way the house sounded at 2 a.m. in a deep winter, the particular settling of old timber in serious cold. The way Clara slept through the worst storms and woke immediately at the sound of the barn door for reasons nobody had ever been able to explain. The way Reed read in the evenings with the lamp turned up high and would look at you occasionally across the room with the expression of someone who has just read something worth sharing, which he might or might not share depending on whether he thought you were at a good stopping point. The way Flint's workshop produced a steady stream of objects whose purpose was not always immediately clear, but which turned out, almost without exception, to have been made for a specific and practical reason he had identified and not mentioned. The way Cade moved through a morning. The particular quality of the silence he occupied, which was different from the silence he had maintained in the early weeks, more inhabited somehow, less defended. He was not a man who would ever be easy in the way of people who come naturally to openness. He was made differently, built in a different way, and she understood that and did not require him to be otherwise. But the walls were not what they had been, and the spaces between the people in that house were not what they had been, and the difference was real even when it was quiet. Spring came to Cedar Ridge the way it always does at altitude, reluctantly, and then all at once the snow pulling back from the valley floor while it stayed on the peaks. The pasture grass coming in with the particular green that exists nowhere but in mountain country. After a long winter so vivid it looks unreal until you have seen it enough times to know it is simply what the season does here. The matter of Aldous Whitfield resolved itself as these things do, through the mechanisms of law and consequence, rather than through any dramatic confrontation. The Colorado Land Office investigation confirmed what the documents established. The Denver company pursued its legal remedies. Whitfield's holdings in the county diminished significantly over the following year as he satisfied the claims against him, And he was not in the subsequent seasons a man who rode up to other people's ranch roads, making observations about what the townspeople might think. The northern pasture of Morrison Ranch remained what it had always been, which was Morrison land, which was the water source for a valley of farms, which was the thing James Morrison had come to Colorado to build, and had built and had left to his sons with the expectation that they would keep it. They kept it. 6 months after the December wedding, on a July morning when the meadow grasses were tall and the air coming off the high peaks was exactly as cold and clean as it had been on Eleanor's first morning at the ranch, she was in the kitchen teaching Clara to make bread. This was serious business. Clara had decided that bread making was a skill she required and had communicated this decision with the gravity she brought to all decisions she had thought about carefully. She stood at the kitchen table with flour on both forearms and a look of concentrated attention that Eleanor found she would have paid a significant sum to paint if she had had any facility with painting, which she did not. Reed was at the kitchen table reading. He had been reading for an hour and had looked up twice to observe the proceedings with the quiet, pleased attention of someone watching something that is going well. Flint was outside somewhere, audible through the open window, as an occasional sound of hammering, which had been going on since breakfast and which nobody had yet asked about, because with Flint the explanation would arrive when it arrived. The back door opened and Cade came in from the morning's work carrying the particular presence of someone who has been outside in the high country air and has brought some of it back with him. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and took in the room. Claire with her arms white to the elbow. Reed with his book. Eleanor watching Clara's hands and correcting the pressure she was applying to the dough with a light word, and then a demonstration, and then Clara trying again with the small frown of someone determined to get it right. He stood there for a moment and simply looked at it the way he sometimes looked at the mountain line at dawn, with the full and unhurried attention of someone who finds the thing in front of them worth that kind of looking. Eleanor became aware of him in the doorway before she heard him. She had learned to read the quality of his presence the way she read other things, through accumulated observation, through the specific details. She glanced back over her shoulder without breaking the rhythm of what she was doing. He came to stand beside her. He placed his hand on her shoulder the way he did now, the same way he had placed the blanket around her shoulders on the night of the storm, with the simple certainty of someone who has stopped needing to make a ceremony of the things that matter most. "Papa," Clara said, looking up from the dough with the serious expression of someone who does not wish to be distracted from an important project, but will make an exception for certain people. "Watch, I am doing it right this time." "Show me," he said. Clara demonstrated. The technique was in fact considerably improved from its earlier iterations. Eleanor had been patient and specific, and Clara had the combination of determination and genuine interest that makes someone teachable, which is rarer than it sounds. "That looks right to me," Cade said. Clara went back to the dough with renewed concentration. Reed turned a page without looking up. The hammering outside paused and then resumed. The kitchen smelled of flour and the coffee still warm on the back of the stove, and the summer air coming through the window, which smelled of the meadow and the pine line on the ridge above the ranch, and the particular clean cold that came down from the high peaks even in July. Clara worked the dough for another minute and then looked up at the window with the expression she sometimes had of a child processing something that had arrived from somewhere and needed consideration. "Mama Eleanor," she said. "Yes." "Are there other ladies sitting on sad benches right now? Ladies who have not found their family yet?" The kitchen was quiet in the way it was quiet when people were listening without indicating that they were listening. Reed's page did not turn. The hammering outside had paused. Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Clara always deserved the seriousness her questions deserved, and because this particular question deserved it for its own reasons. "I think there probably are," she said. "Will they find their families?" Eleanor looked at this child who had walked across a train station platform on a cold October afternoon to sit beside a stranger because her mother had told her it cost nothing, and sometimes it was the exact thing a person needed. Who had asked a sad woman if she could sing and taken her hand without asking, and said, "Did Mama send you?" and accepted the answer, "I don't know," with the nod of someone who understood that some things are real even before they can be proven. Sometimes, Eleanor said, the best things find us when we have stopped believing they can. And sometimes the families that matter most are not the ones we plan for. They are the ones that were made out of something simpler than planning. She paused. A child who checks on sad people. A man who puts wood by someone's stove without being asked. A set of brothers who know how to stand beside each other without being told to. She looked at Clara steadily. Those things, built into a family one piece at a time. Clara absorbed this with the nod of someone filing it in the correct place. So they might, she said. They might, Eleanor agreed. Clara looked back at her bread dough and gave it one more firm, practiced push with the heel of her hand, and the technique was exactly right. Good, she said with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed two things simultaneously and found both of them correct. Outside, the Rocky Mountains stood in the July morning as they had stood before the ranch existed, before the town existed, before anyone had come to this particular valley and decided it was worth building a life in. They would stand after all of it, too patient and indifferent to human scale in the way that only very large and very old things can be. But in the kitchen of a ranch house at the base of those mountains, in the warmth of a July morning, in the smell of bread beginning and coffee still warm, in the summer air moving through an open window, something was happening that had nothing to do with indifference. It was the ordinary, extraordinary thing that happens when people who belong together find each other and choose to stay. It had begun on a train platform bench with a piece of paper and a little girl with two braids and a bear with one good ear. It had moved through hard country and harder weather and the patient necessary work of building trust between people who had learned to be careful with it. And it had arrived here, which it turned out was exactly where it was always going.